In the heart of a bitter winter, as snow piled high and winds howled through the valley, Levi Stoltzfus faced a challenge that would test not only his skill, but his faith. His family's survival in the unforgiving cold depended on a single invention, the stove he believed could protect them all. But would his design, which defied tradition and logic, be enough to keep the frost from taking what mattered most? Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of simple faith and ingenuity, join us for tomorrow's tale of courage and warmth. The Amish farm was still beneath a blanket of thick, cold snow. The air had turned sharp and unforgiving, biting at the cheeks and filling the lungs with ice. Levi Stoltzfus watched through the frosted windows as the blizzard raged outside. He could see the edge of his farm, his land swallowed by the white expanse. In that frozen silence, the house itself seemed to hum with the stillness of winter's grasp. Inside the house, warmth was a fragile thing. Their simple, unadorned stove, a structure made of metal and stone, had always done the job before, but the storms this year were different. His sons had spent hours stacking the firewood by the door, but they couldn't seem to bring enough in to fight the cold. Levi paced through the kitchen where his wife Esther was tending to the children. The faint flicker of candlelight danced on the walls, its warmth mingling with the scent of bread baking. The children's laughter cut through the silence like a prayer answered, but Levi could not ignore the gnawing anxiety that tightened his chest. No matter how many times he refueled the stove, the cold seemed to find its way into the walls, into his bones. He'd always believed in the strength of tradition, in the tools that had been passed down through generations of men before him. His father had taught him how to build, how to work with his hands, how to live in harmony with the land. Yet as the wind howled outside, Levi found himself staring at the stove, his mind racing. The fire inside burned brightly, but it wasn't enough to keep the house warm through the night. And it wasn't enough to keep the cold from creeping into the lives of his family. He couldn't ignore the thought anymore. He would build a stove that could withstand this kind of cold. He would build something that would keep his family warm and safe, even in the most brutal of winters. That night, as he lay beside his wife in their bed of hand-stitched quilts, the idea took root in his mind. His eyes drifted to the ceiling beams, thick and strong, the handiwork of his father. This stove would be his legacy, one that would serve his children and grandchildren long after the storms had passed. It would be sturdy, simple, and efficient, just as their people had always been. But it would also be something more. Levi's hands were calloused from years of work, and the bench in his workshop was cluttered with scraps of wood, nails, and bits of iron. The air inside the shop was warmer than the rest of the house, thanks to a small iron stove, but the warmth was fleeting. Levi had spent the past few days sketching, drawing plans with pencil and paper, his mind consumed by the task. He'd studied every available design, weighed every possibility, but nothing felt quite right. He'd heard whispers from the neighbors, old men sitting on porches during the summer, who spoke of their own stoves. Most of them were content with their models, content to use the same designs that had worked for generations. But Levi knew in his heart that what had worked before was no longer enough. Not for the storms coming this year, not for his family. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Levi ventured out into the barn. The sound of the wind whistling through the trees was almost soothing, like a song of the earth, as though the land itself was speaking to him. He touched the wood of the barn door, the grain so familiar beneath his fingers, and looked out toward the dark fields that stretched beyond. The design began to take shape in his mind. A stove like no other large, with a double-walled chamber for better heat retention. He would make it from cast iron, not the thin metal sheets that others used. It would be heavy, solid, and built to last. Levi thought of the old blacksmith, Jacob Fisher, whose forge had never failed him when he needed the right tool or piece of iron. Jacob's words echoed in Levi's mind. Strength is in the weight of things, in their ability to endure. That night, Levi's plans took form. His stove would have a simple design, nothing extravagant, but it would have a thick metal core and a large, efficient firebox. The fire would be contained, but it would not smother. The heat would radiate, not just rise from the top. He would use stone to line the inside of the stove, as the stones would hold the heat longer than metal alone. This way, even when the fire burned low, the stove would continue to keep his family warm. Levi spent the next weeks gathering the materials, pieces of cast iron, stone slabs from the local quarry, and tools from the blacksmith. He worked late into the night, his hands aching from the effort, but his heart was light. With each passing day, the stove grew more real. It was not just an object, it was hope, a testament to his belief in his family and his faith. When the stove was finally complete, Levi stood back, admiring his work. It was larger than the traditional stoves, solid and imposing, but simple in its purpose. There were no frills, no unnecessary additions. He had made it to endure the winter, just as his ancestors had made tools to endure their own trials. That night, as the fire roared in the new stove and warmth spread through the rooms, Levi sat with his family, content. The wind outside continued to howl, but inside they were safe. The warmth he had sought for so long had come not just from the stove, but from his labor, his faith, and his belief in what was possible. He had built something that would last. The wind howled like a beast outside, but within the walls of Levi Stoltzfus's home, the warmth felt like a soft embrace. For the first time in weeks, Levi could sit comfortably by the fire without the constant worry of cold seeping through the walls. His family gathered around the hearth, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the wood smoke. But even as the warmth filled the room, Levi could not fully relax. He watched his children playing near the stove, the crackling fire warming their faces, and his wife Esther preparing the evening meal. Still, a feeling of unease lingered in his chest. The storm outside was relentless, the snow piling up in the fields. He knew this was just the beginning. What if the stove wasn't enough? What if the cold would find a way in after all? That night, as the temperature dropped to well below freezing, Levi lay awake. The wind rattled the windows, and he could hear the creaking of the barn as it fought against the storm. He listened intently for any change in the stove's performance. Would the heat last through the night, or would it fade like it always had in the past? He couldn't shake the memory of that first night when the stove had been just a plan, a vision. The cold was so fierce then that it seemed to have a life of its own, creeping through the cracks, chilling his bones even while the fire burned in the hearth. But tonight there was no such feeling. The stove hummed quietly, radiating a constant warmth. He could hear the fire crackling within, but it was not an anxious sound, not a sound of a stove struggling to stay alive. It was a sound of a fire in control, steady and unyielding. Esther woke in the night to find Levi still awake, staring at the stove. She reached for his hand and squeezed it. "It's working, Levi," she said softly. "We're safe." Levi nodded but didn't speak. He had spent his entire life trusting in the work of his hands, in the designs passed down through generations. But this stove was different. It was more than just a way to survive. It was his answer to the harshness of the world outside. It was the bridge between faith and labor, a symbol of resilience. And yet, he couldn't shake the fear that it might not be enough. As the days passed, the storm worsened, and Levi found himself constantly monitoring the stove. He would tend to the fire every few hours, ensuring that it burned steadily. Esther noticed his vigilance but did not question him. She trusted him as she always had, knowing that his quiet determination had always been the backbone of their family. One afternoon, a neighbor, Jacob Lapp, arrived at the farm with his family. The storm had closed off the roads, and they had nowhere else to turn. Levi welcomed them inside, offering them a place by the fire. As Jacob sat near the stove, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You've done something with this stove, Levi," Jacob said. "It's warmer in here than I've ever felt in my own house." Levi smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. "It's my design," he said simply. "It should last through the worst of it." That night, as the storm continued to rage outside, Levi finally allowed himself to relax. The stove was performing as it was meant to, providing warmth not just for his own family, but for those who needed it most. The winter months stretched on, unrelenting in their cold. Snow piled high against the walls of Levi's barn, and the land seemed to disappear under the heavy weight of winter. For weeks, the storms had not relented, each one worse than the last. And yet, in Levi's home, there was always warmth. The stove, steady and unyielding, kept the cold at bay. But as much as Levi trusted his design, a small part of him was still on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong, that despite all his hard work, Despite the careful construction, there was still something he had overlooked. The fire inside the stove was warm, but the thought of the house failing, of his family being exposed to the elements once more, lingered like a shadow over him. One day, as the snowstorm raged with even more fury than before, a loud knock came at the door. Levi opened it to find Jacob Lapp standing on the porch, his face pale, his clothes dusted with snow. Behind him stood his wife, Ruth, and their 2 children, all of them looking exhausted and fearful. "Levi," Jacob said urgently, his voice tense, "we need help. Our stove's gone out. The wind's pushing the snow through the cracks, and the cold is unbearable. We've tried everything we can, but the house is freezing." Levi's heart sank. It was hard to believe Jacob had always been prepared, always had a sturdy cabin with the best tools. But now, standing in front of him, Jacob's face told a different story. The storm had not only tested Levi's stove, it had tested the limits of every home in the valley. Without a word, Levi nodded, stepping aside to let Jacob and his family inside. He could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the way their cheeks were flushed with cold, their breath heavy in the frigid air. "You'll be warm here," Levi said softly, motioning to the fire. "The stove will heat the house better than any other." Jacob hesitated, looking at the stove with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "You really think it'll make a difference?" he asked, his voice raw with worry. "I know it will," Levi said, his voice steady. "It was built for this, trust me." As they gathered around the stove, the warmth began to fill the room, the heat wrapping around them like a blanket. Ruth smiled softly, her eyes closed as she tilted her head back, savoring the warmth for the first time in days. Levi sat back in his chair, watching his family and their friends find comfort in the glow of the stove. He knew this was more than just a simple piece of engineering, it was a symbol of everything they had worked for, everything they had built together. It wasn't just the stove that had kept them warm, it was their faith in each other, their trust in the work of their hands, and the quiet belief that even in the harshest winter they would endure. As the storm howled outside, Levi closed his eyes, allowing the warmth to seep into his bones. The storm had come, and it would go. But with his stove, with his family, and with his faith, he knew he could face whatever lay ahead. The days turned into weeks, and the storm that had once seemed endless finally began to subside. The sun pierced the sky, casting long, slanted shadows over the snow-covered fields. The weight of winter lifted, but Levi Stoltzfus's home remained as warm as it had been when the first snow had fallen. The stove, now a fixture in their home, had proven itself. Not only had it kept his family safe through the coldest season they'd ever faced, but it had become a symbol of resilience, a symbol of his quiet, steadfast faith in the simple things. Jacob and Ruth Lapp, along with their children, had stayed with Levi throughout the worst of the winter. And as the days grew milder, they had returned to their own home, which now had a stove just like Levi's. It wasn't just a gift of warmth, it was a gift of survival. And as the word spread through the community, others came too, seeking Levi's knowledge. One evening, as Levi worked in his barn, hammering nails into a new project, he heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Jacob Lapp standing in the doorway, his face tired but smiling. "You were right, Levi," Jacob said, his voice warm with gratitude. "Our stove saved us. We've told everyone who'll listen about it." Levi nodded, wiping his brow. "It wasn't just the stove, Jacob. It was the trust. The trust that no matter how hard the winter is, we have what we need if we rely on each other." Jacob placed a hand on Levi's shoulder. "That's the lesson we'll carry with us." And with that, Levi understood. The stove was not just a practical tool, it was a reminder that faith, hard work, and community were what truly kept them warm, not just in winter, but in every season of life. As he watched Jacob walk back to his home, Levi felt a quiet satisfaction. His work would live on, not just in the stove he had built, but in the lives it had touched. The warmth he had created would never fade,